So, welcome to the second seminar in our series of 4 that we're doing. And we're trying to cover everything we can think of on topics that have been suggested by people who wanted to turn up. And it's ways to help you reduce your energy bills, reduce your energy use, and reduce your carbon footprint. This evening, for the very first time, between 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock, the National Grid were paying people not to use electricity. It's never happened before. Believe it or not, they were paying you £3 per kilowatt hour not to put something on, as opposed to your normal rate that you might be paying 36p or 70p. Such is the way the National Grid and the power consumption is going in this country. Reducing consumption is really, really crucial, and expect to see more of that in the coming months and years. We have the worst housing stock in Europe for being too cold in winter and too hot in summer. In 2019, the housing stock in this country contributed over 66 million tonnes of CO2, just due to the heating. It represents a huge portion of the UK's CO2 emissions, and, as we're finding out the hard way, a growing portion of our day-to-day expenditure in energy costs. So tonight we're covering 2 areas that are key for anyone who is thinking about the process of making the essential changes in their accommodation to reduce their energy costs and carbon footprint. It's often referred to as the retrofit process, and hopefully tonight you will go away fully understanding what retrofitting is all about. We're going to split it into 2 halves. The first half is about retrofitting, the second half is all about planning consent. And we've got a very amazing panel of experts on planning consent from Lambeth and Southwark, and we've got architects and property consultants, and people experienced with housing and stock on college estate. And then afterwards, we're going to have networking where you can have a free glass of wine or beer or juice or what have you, chinwag with the expert, ask all the awkward questions that maybe you didn't have a chance to ask after the sessions before you go home. So, to kick off this evening, we have a session all about the retrofitting process, and I'd like to welcome Ian Preston, who is the retrofit coordinator from EcoFirm.
So my name's Ian Preston. I'm a retrofit coordinator, which I'll explain a little bit in a few minutes. And I work for EcoFirm, which is a retrofit service for what's called the able to pay market in Greater London. So that means mostly client funded work rather than grant funded. And EcoFirm is a kind of a joint project of 2 companies. One is Parity Projects, and the other is Retrofit Works. Parity Projects is a data specialist who specialises in modelling the energy performance of homes on a large scale. Retrofit Works is a cooperative of practitioners, retrofit practitioners, so that includes installers, assessors, coordinators, a few architects. Sorry. Okay. I'm getting an echo, so I thought maybe I was too close to the microphone.
Get a bit of feedback.
Okay. So Retrofit Works is a cooperative, and EcoFirm is a joint project of those 2 organisations. I'm going to be looking today at, first of all, what do we mean when we say retrofit?
Correct.
What do we mean by whole house retrofit, which is maybe not as obvious as it might seem. I'll be looking at the key roles and stages in the typical retrofit process, typical timescales for a retrofit project, some of the challenges we've encountered to successful retrofit, and very briefly, some tips on how to find the right installers. So what do we mean by retrofit? Retrofit is installing energy efficiency measures in a home that weren't part of the original design. And does that include extensions and loft conversions and so on? But often our clients are also planning an extension or loft conversion, but it's not really our focus for a number of reasons. One is that an extension will have its own architect or designer. It has to comply in every respect with building regulations, and it will be built all in one go. So the kind of advice I would provide about what to do or not to do and in what sort of order is a little bit redundant where extensions and loft conversion is concerned. Plus I don't really want to step on the designer's toes. But there are a couple of aspects of extensions and loft conversions that I am interested in to do with the junction with the existing part of the house. So the existing parts of the house are my focus, and I'm interested in how an extension joins on to the existing home. I can go into more detail about that at the end of this time if you're interested, but I don't dwell into it. What do we mean by whole house retrofit? That's the phrase we use, but it doesn't literally mean that it's not always a house. It often is in London. It could be a flat, or it could be a block of flats, or it could be a row of terraced houses or a pair of semi-detached houses. But whatever the scope of the retrofit project, we consider it holistically. So we look at the whole building. So we look at it from a technical point of view, but we also take into account issues like the comfort, health, and well-being of the occupants. A whole house retrofit, rather than being piecemeal, is strategic and planned. So, for example, whereas in the past, a homeowner might have installed double glazing because they were persuaded to buy it, but they might have spent quite a lot of money on their double glazing, but they might not have enough loft insulation, which is a much more obvious and cheaper and simpler measure to install. So we're kind of looking at the whole building, considering what to do, what not to do, in what kind of sensible order, what are the benefits and the costs, what's worth doing. With whole house retrofit, we try to take a fabric first approach. What that means is that you aim to insulate and make the building airtight first before you consider things like new heating system or renewable energy technologies. And that way you reduce the demand for energy before you provide energy with new systems. You make sure that whatever you install, the technology you install is correctly sized for the building as it will be. If you do it the other way around, you can end up with, for example, a boiler or a heat pump that's oversized for the insulated and airtight building. Whole house retrofit also considers the interfaces between measures. So I mean that literally in terms of junctions between windows, doors, walls, roofs, floors, how they meet. But also by interfaces I mean how these measures will be installed on a practical level, in what sort of order. Are there any, I hate the word synergies, but are there any savings to be achieved by doing particular measures at the same time? So for example, if you need scaffolding for wall insulation, windows and solar panels, then it probably makes sense to group those measures together. Put scaffolding once rather than several times. The reason for considering the junction of two measures is to avoid what we call unintended consequences. So that's things like cold spots, because you've got no gap in the air tightness layer or in the insulation wrapping building. Cold spots can lead to things like condensation, mold, rotten timbers, rusting metal fixings, and so on. In the past, retrofit hasn't always been done correctly, so there are horror stories about measures like cavity wall insulation that have been installed badly or inappropriately that cause all sorts of problems in the building. So we're aiming to not do that in the future. One of the ways we avoid unintended consequences and take into account the health and well-being of the occupants is by considering ventilation. So homes are typically underventilated by design. When they're drafty and leaky, they may well have enough fresh air, but it's by accident. So the routes for providing fresh air into the building, getting damp, stale air out of the building aren't designed there, accidental and unplanned. And when you insulate and make a building airtight, what you want to avoid is sealing it up and making a kind of airtight Tupperware box kind of scenario where moisture and other pollutants build up inside the home. That can exacerbate problems like condensation and mold, which have all sorts of consequences for the health of the household, but also for the building. So you want to avoid structural issues and unsightly problems that will be expensive to fix. And another aspect of whole house retrofit is contractor awareness, by which I mean making sure that each installer knows how their little bit of the overall job fits with the other parts of the job. So how their measure is sequenced and interacts with the other measures. So we don't just recommend that you get in wall insulation installed without also telling them what else is happening and considering what order things will happen in. Here you can see the typical roles in a retrofit, and so I'll talk you through those and then explain the stages they correspond to. So the first role that's been defined in the industry is a retrofit advisor, and that's someone with kind of a base level of knowledge about retrofit who can give you the initial advice when you first make contact with an organisation like us, and they can explain roughly how the process works and what to expect. The next role is a retrofit assessor. So that's the person who will visit your home early on in the retrofit process. They will survey it and they will gather information for the other participants in the process and come on later. So initially they'll provide information to the retrofit coordinator, but also down the line to retrofit designers and installers. And that survey typically takes a couple of hours, but it depends on the size and complexity of the home. It includes the energy assessment you might have had done if you've ever sold or bought a home in the last, or rented a home in the last 15 years or so. So you need an energy performance certificate, and you will have had, if you needed one of those certificates, you will have had a domestic energy assessor who will come in and measure the home, draw floor plans, record what the home is made of and what sort of systems you have in place for lighting, heating, providing hot water. So that survey is included in the retrofit assessment, but there's more information gathered as well because the requirements is greater. So a retrofit assessor will also be taking lots of photographs. So anyone who comes on later can sort of see as much as possible about the inside and outside of the house. They'll be recording any defects. So things like structural problems or damp issues that we would recommend are fixed and given time to settle and improve before certain retrofit measures are installed. And also they were looking at ventilation, so they'll be doing an initial assessment of the ventilation in the home. So the retrofit coordinator knows whether to recommend an upgrade. And in fact, we nearly always do. Just because most existing homes, unless they're very new, are underventilated. The next role is the retrofit coordinator. So I'm a retrofit coordinator. I'm also a retrofit assessor, but mainly a coordinator. So you might find that these roles are not necessarily different people. So sometimes one individual might combine more than one role. But also each of those roles is not always the same person. So our service is currently focused on the early advice stages. So that's my focus, but retrofit coordinators as well as making recommendations to the customer early on. May also be involved in the install. So that we're setting requirements, not writing a specification, because that's too specialised a role. You need a retrofit designer for that. But setting general requirements for the retrofit that's done for the other participants to work to. The retrofit coordinator may also be reviewing quotes from installers for the client and oversee the install. They're not quite like a project manager, so they probably won't be there every day, but they'll be visiting site regularly during the retrofit, just making sure it's proceeding as planned. And then they go in at the end and sign off the measures for the client. Retrofit designer. If there's an architect involved, they will be the retrofit designer, but often there isn't for retrofit to an existing building if there are no new build elements. So usually the retrofit designer in that scenario is the installer and or the provider of the system they install. So if you take an example like solid wall insulation, particularly external wall insulation, each installer will have certain systems they install, and the manufacturer and supplier of that system will have standard details for insulating a building. So, for example, what to do when you insulate around a window or door, how to treat the junction of a wall with the overhanging roof, how to treat the base of the wall, ground level. And then the installer will be implementing those details, so they kind of share the role of retrofit design between them. And then you have a retrofit install, which is the contractor for each measure. Fairly straightforward. And then the last one there is a role called the retrofit evaluator, which was defined a few years ago. But last time I looked, there was no qualification or accreditation or anything like that for that role, so I'm not sure whether it's happening. But that is a person who notionally will go into a building after the retrofit and kind of monitor how the retrofit building is performing, whether the measures are working as they should, whether the energy savings are as projected, whether the clients are happy with their retrofit home, whether they know how to use the systems that have been installed. Reporting back, so the idea is the evaluator will feed into the process and improve it over time. But like I say, I'm not sure whether that role is happening yet. Talk a little bit more about the retrofit coordinator. So, like I said, I'm also a retrofit assessor, so I sometimes do my own assessments, but often I'm using another assessor's assessment. So I get involved when they've been into a home, measured it up, made lots of notes, taking lots of photos, and they hand over to me. And if they're good assessors, that process works pretty well. So they give me enough information, but I almost feel like I've been there. I'm pretty confident I know the building inside out. Later on, if I really need to visit site, I will do that. But initially, hopefully, the retrofit assessor can be my amazing ears. So the retrofit coordinator's first responsibility is to make sure that cohesive retrofit plan has been designed. So when the assessment's taking place, we look at the information the assessor has gathered. The assessor builds a base model, an energy model of the home, and then we look at the impact of various different improvement measures. So we have a long list of measures we can look at, and we review the list. We see how much roughly they will cost, how much energy they will save, how much they will reduce bills, how much carbon they will save, and then we make from that long list of potential measures, we come up with a short list of recommendations. So that's typically the measures that give you the best return on your investment in terms of bill savings and/or carbon emissions, hopefully both. And then we also consider ventilation. So ventilation is not saving you any money on your bill. It's not saving any carbon. Hopefully it'll be using very little energy, but it will be giving you great benefits in terms of the health of the building and of the occupants. Having drawn up our list of recommendations, we produced what's called a whole house retrofit plan. And I'll show you a few pages from an example in a minute. And that's the first deliverable for a client. And that's a standard. So we have our own version of that. It's a sort of a standard document in the retrofit industry now. So if you are planning a retrofit of your home, then a whole house retrofit plan is one of the first things to receive. And what it will give you is a sort of a phased and ordered set of recommendations. So having picked the measures we think are most worthwhile, we put them in a sensible order, taking into account, I mentioned before, fabric first approach, but also savings on things like scaffolding and practical considerations. So, for example, we recommend that you don't insulate solid walls, either internally or externally, until you've replaced any doors and windows you're replacing and put in new ventilation. And that's just a practical consideration. You don't want to disturb so typically externally insulated walls will have a nice rendered finish. You don't want to disturb that rendered finish or the insulation underneath by making holes in the walls. You want to get all that done first. So we consider all sorts of aspects like that. The next step that the retrofit coordinator might be involved in is setting requirements for the retrofit design. So like I said, that's not the specification because the retrofit coordinator isn't usually qualified to make a detailed specification. So that detailed specification really needs to be by an expert in each measure. So, for example, if a project included an air source heat pump as a new heat source, the retrofit coordinator wouldn't decide what model or size of heat pump was recommended. They would just gather information about the home, what's proposed in terms of insulation and air tightness and new windows and so on. Hand that information over to a specialist and make sure that the specialist considers everything they need to consider and then check their quote to make sure it is what they're asking for. The retrofit coordinator may also review quotes for the client, not so much from the point of view of cost, but more the appropriateness of what's proposed. So whether the materials are recommended for the type of building, whether they've included everything they were asked to include, whether they appear to have considered the other measures that are proposed. And then finally, the retrofit coordinator may be on site overseeing and signing off the installations. I said I'd show you a few pages from a whole house plan. So here's one I did a while ago. So you can see a bar chart showing you the red bars are the current energy use. The orange bars are the projected energy use after the package of measures that we're recommending. And then the green bars are the savings from renewables. And it's showing you the second column there, the orange column is the EPC rate, current and projected. There you can see at the top, the proposed measures are split into phases. And it just gives you a breakdown of the total costs and savings. And then there's a bit more detail on the phases, what each phase, what we're recommending. The whole house plan isn't set in stone, so the idea is you produce the plan at the start of the retrofit process, and then it's a working document, a living document. So it can be amended to fit the client's plans, their budget, their family situation, how long they're planning on staying in the home, and so on. Timescales. Well, there's a variety of ways, variety of timescales for retrofit projects. So I have clients ranging from someone who's just bought a new home, maybe haven't even moved in yet, and they're perhaps planning a total deep retrofit before they move in. So everything will be done more or less at once. And at the other end of the scale, the retrofit could be spread over up to 20 to 30 years. And that might not all be the same owner of the home. So the idea as well is that the whole house plan is part of the package you hand over to the buyer of a home. You sort of say, this is what we did, this is where we are, over to you. And the plan can be revised at any point. So if the new owner's priorities are different, then we can adjust the plan, fit it to a new budget. Another consideration as well as budget is the amount of disruption the household can stand. So that's considering things like how big the home is, how many occupants there are, how much spare space there is in the home, whether there's room to, if you're doing a sort of a room by room approach to retrofit, whether there's space to move belongings out of some rooms while they're retrofitted to other parts of the house, whether the household are planning to move out while their home is retrofitted, or whether it's actually quite a high occupation level in the home, meaning that it's got to be done carefully because they've got to live there for the duration. So those are the extremes. So a project where the retrofit is done in a short space of time, maybe a few months. They retrofit spread over 20 to 30 years and everything in between. So I suppose a typical average situation is a client who has some money to spend now, but a limited budget immediately, but they're anticipating perhaps in 5 or 10 years they will have saved more and they'll be able to tackle more measures. So what they're looking for from someone like me is some sensible advice about what order to do things in, what to do, what to bother with, so they can plan, basically. So we've encountered a number of challenges to retrofit, and these are the main ones. The first one is install availability, so whether you can find anyone who has time to quote and has time to install. And obviously the good installers, the ones who really know what they're doing, are the busiest. So it's always a struggle to get the attention of an installer, get them to quote, and then hopefully, if they can quote, they're available to install soon after before the costs rise too much. Skills is another challenge. So it's not only whether there's an installer available to install, but whether they are knowledgeable and trained and accredited to install the right materials and the right technologies. So we only recommend certain insulation materials for traditional buildings. And it can be quite a struggle to get installers to quote for what we ask for. So for example, we want what's called vapor open materials for traditional buildings. So that means insulation that allows water vapour to move in and out of the building fabric. Quite often I ask for that and I get a quote for non-vapour open insulation materials and non-vapour open render. So I have to send the quote back and say, no, that's not what I asked for. And the reason sometimes is that the installer just doesn't have, just hadn't used those materials before. Isn't trained to use what I'm asking for. So it can be quite a long-term process to encourage installers to expand what they can do, get trained up, and to convince them there is a market for those skills. Costs are the next one. So we're finding costs particularly volatile at the moment, to the extent that some of the installers we work with are revising their cost list almost weekly and giving quotes for very short term durations. So a few years ago, you'd maybe get a 3-month validity on a quote, and lately it's a matter of weeks. You might find, if you decide to proceed with a quote a few weeks later that it hasn't changed much, or you might find the contractor wants to revisit it, look again at their supply chain and overhaul the quote. And it's always a problem, I think, with construction, particularly at the moment. Things like Brexit, war in Eastern Europe, the aftermath of COVID, the economic crisis, materials and labour are increasingly expensive. That brings me on to funding, which is no challenge. So, as I said, EcoFood is for the client-funded market. So most of the measures we recommend are going to be paid for by the owner of the home. There are a few exceptions, 1 or 2 exceptions to that. The truth is not much funding is available if you're not receiving benefits. The main one I can think of is the boiler upgrade scheme, which is where you can get £5,000 or £6,000 up front for replacing something like a gas boiler with an air source or ground source heat pump. Certain boroughs have their own initiatives. So I know Camden has got a 5,000 grant scheme. I'm not aware of anything similar in Lambeth or Southwark at the moment. There's plenty of grants for people receiving benefits. So Retrofit Works, one of the companies involved in EcoFood, also is involved in the Mayor of London's Warner Home scheme. I forget what the amount of money is that's available per household, but it's not available to everyone. So it's not much use for most of my clients, unfortunately. And then the last challenge, it's a relatively minor one in my case, and that's planning. So lots of the measures I recommend happen inside the house or are not particularly visually intrusive, so often you don't need planning permission. But I think the one I find most difficult is external wall insulation. And the reason it's a problem is because there seems to be a lack of consistency from borough to borough about how external wall insulation is treated. So that makes it difficult when you do your first job in a particular borough, not knowing what the council wants. It's quite hard to find out. So one in the extreme, I know some boroughs in London just don't care. And if you told them you were going to insulate your walls, they're certainly shrug and say, get on with it. At the other end, you have boroughs who want full planning application with drawings. They want to know exactly what it's going to look like, exactly what the windows will look like, and the reveals are insulated and so on. And then various situations in between. So generally, I'd recommend if you're unsure, write to the council, to the planning department, tell them what you're proposing, ask them to confirm that they consider it permanent development. And if they need a planning application, they'll tell you at that stage. But fingers crossed you won't. Unless, obviously, if you're listed building a conservation area, the rules are stricter. And then lastly, I'll talk briefly about finding installers. Like I said, it's not always easy to find the right installers. I'm sure you can find bad ones, but finding good ones who are available is difficult. But I think the main 2 sources are Trustmark, which is the government scheme for quality control of works in and around your home. So it doesn't just cover retrofit, it covers all sorts of works, but including insulation, air tightness, ventilation, things like that. And their website has a search facility that lets you search by area and by measure, by the work you want to install. And that will give you a list of approved accredited installers. And then the other source is MCS, the Microgeneration Certification Scheme, which covers things like solar photovoltaic, solar thermal heat pumps. And if you're considering any of those measures, make sure the installer belongs to that scheme, and the job is certified under the scheme. That just ensures that they not only install properly but design properly. So that will, if you're considering a heat pump, and avoid issues like finding your house is cold when you install a heat pump. A heat pump installer who belongs to that scheme, before they make a recommendation for a heat pump, give you a quote, they will come in, actually not necessarily before they give you a quote, before they finalise their quote, they will come in and they will do a survey, a little bit like one retrofit assessor, a bit more detail, and that looks at the heat loss from each room in the home. So what each room is made of, how it's insulated, what the windows are like, what the heating system for the home is, what the controls are, how big the radiators are. And not only that process will not only size the equipment for your home, but also size the individual radiators. So as well as the quote for a new heat pump, it will also give you a list of those radiators that need replacing, the bigger ones, to ensure that your house is going to be warm enough. And I think that's pretty much all I had to say. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Yes.
So I'm just going to get the microphone in for you if we want to record your question for posterity.
It wasn't, so. Tell us what your qualifications are as a retrofit coordinator. What's your discipline? What's your background? Because all this is completely new to me, so I don't know what any of these terms mean, and I don't know how you'd know, how I would know as a member of the public whether I've got the right person as a coordinator or an assessor, or what's the question?
There is a qualification for each of those roles. And for retrofit coordinator, there's what's called a level 5 diploma in retrofit coordination. So any retrofit coordinator should be able to show you their certificate and give you their accreditation. Likewise for assessors, advisors. But in terms of background, I think that's the most recent qualification I have is the retrofit assessor qualification, which was a later qualification. Before I joined as a retrofit coordinator, I'd also been working in the industry for about 15 years, doing things like code for sustainable homes, speaker homes, green and thermal domestic buildings. I did passive house training a few years ago. So the retrofit coordination qualification is just the latest. And you'll find a bit of variation in the specialisation. So some retrofit coordinators are more, they're stronger in the sort of theoretical end, the modelling, that kind of thing. Others are more experienced in the on-site sort of supervision of installers. But we're all trained up to kind of a minimum level across the board, but backgrounds vary from individuals.
Question at the back, then we'll come down to you.
How much does it cost to get, say, someone like you round to do, or an assessor to do an initial assessment of a property? Because I do realise that, I've done this over the years, I've tried to do home improvements that I think are the right thing to do, but I suspect they might turn out not to be. I don't want to spend money, say, putting double glazing in, which I've done, and just find out the all windows have to have vents above them, don't they, legally by law in a year or two?
They're pretty much standard triple vents.
Yeah, I see. When we had double glazing put in or no triple vents, they weren't offered in the double glazing, etc.
Yeah.
But what I'm wondering is whether it's cost effective to say get someone like you in or an assessor in to look at the whole house, as you say, to have a plan.
Yeah.
So you know whatever tiny bit you do, whether that's new windows or whatever, feeds into the whole thing. So I'm interested to see roughly how much that would cost.
So typically the way it works is you buy a whole house plan, and the retrofit assessment, so the survey, and the initial involvement of the coordinator is included in that. And the costs vary, but currently we're charging, for, I think, latest fees 540 for anything across a very large, so that covers things up to 8 main rooms. That's quite a big house.
And I had mine, there were some suggestions that they had where the payback would be 120 years. So it's kind of nice to know what probably isn't worth it. Obviously, I'll be around it, but it's probably not worth it. Other things that are really good, fast payback, you kind of think, great, I'll go for that. Sure.
Some things will never pay for themselves. There are no benefits in installing them in terms of bill savings or carbon reduction, so ventilation emission. Won't save you anything, but I definitely wouldn't recommend retrofitting your house without putting in some additional ventilation. And
Pushing down here in front. Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
Thank you. I suspect, like many people around here, I live in a converted Victorian house, converted into 4 flats. We're in the middle, unfortunate position of having a flat above, below, and on your side of it. So in that respect, we're quite cosy, only about 5 walls but nonetheless, there's air coming in from all over the place. God knows where, I haven't got yet. And obviously the outside bits. Is it practical to retrofit a single flat in a building like that? Or do we really need to be looking at, again, the whole building to really make work?
it's definitely worth retrofitting a flat. I say ideally, it would be great if we could not do retrofit on a dwelling by dwelling basis. So if it's a detached house, obviously a detached house isn't a street building. Ideally, we would be retrofitting whole buildings rather than homes, individual homes. And one of the main reasons for that is that if you've got a solid wall building, you don't have the option of insulating cavity, so it's the cavity. So you've got the insulation inside or outside those walls. My recommendation is usually, my preference is usually externally, if it's possible, because it minimises the thermal bridging issues that are considered. So I can't remember if I explained thermal bridging. So thermal bridging is basically cold bridges where you might have insulation on most of the building, but just the odd bits where you can't install or didn't install for one reason or another. You've got heat loss through that part of the building. And if you insulate externally, insulate walls externally, you're basically insulating straight across junctions between the walls and things like internal walls and separating floors. Just the insulation goes straight over, so you don't need to worry about those junctions. You can insulate internally, which is usually the option you have to consider if it's a flat. And then you have to think, well, how do I treat? So I'm insulating the inner face of my wall. What do I do when I come to an internal wall? What do I do at the floor above and below the room I'm standing in? And there are solutions for it. It's easy to insulate externally. So that's why ideally we would be wrapping whole buildings in insulation. Doing whole buildings, for me, it only economies of scale started doing that, but it's just not usually practical.
One question over there?
Some of the work you're describing is a great way to solve team for the whole. So it's then attempting to combine it with some other development whole. So how do you work with anything else? Is with other architects and designers in parallel on the same thing, or do they specialize on this sort of things as well?
It depends on the job. So there are some projects where the home is already, in most respects, the way the owners want it, but they might be living there a long time. They've only recently become aware that they need to insulate or make airtight and reduce their bills. couple of carbon emissions. Or there might be a whole, complete refurb planned, including extensions, loft conversions, remodelling of the existing rooms, new bathrooms, new kitchens, things like that. So it depends entirely. I think my preference, what makes me, what I like to see if I do my own surveys, I go in and I see a blank canvas. So bare floorboards, for example, because I know there's an opportunity there to take the floorboards and insulate them. And I'd say 90% of the homes I survey, I go, there's a very nice engineered timber floor. I know there's no insulation under there, but I also know it's going to be a struggle to persuade the clients to take that floor up and insulate, or take up any of that floor to insulate them. So yeah, it can be standalone. Retrofit can be standalone, or it can be in conjunction with other improvements.
Yeah, questions down here? James?
You're a Victoria Terrace house, if you've got an external retrofit
Yeah,
and it comes next to the neighbour,
yeah.
and they don't want an external retrofit, how do you stop a cold bridge from where your external cladding ends?
So typically in a situation like that, we have what we call a return of internal wall insulation on that corner. To avoid, so obviously the party wall is only insulated up to your side of the dividing line. You want to avoid heat loss through the party wall and the neighbour's side of that line. So what you typically do is just install a thin layer of insulation internally. And if you have alcoves, for example, with chimney breast, it makes sense. You don't actually need that return to extend the full width of the alcove. Because the heat loss from the start of the chimney breast is not that great. But at the other end of the alcove, the heat loss is quite great. It makes sense just for practical visual reasons to insulate the whole of that alcove, rather than have a sort of set out.
Any other question?
Yeah, I live on the other side of the hill in a 1920s estate. It's a mixture of public and private housing. And I wondered if anyone has done a retrofit suggesting or designs for entire estates. The houses are pretty similar. They all have very thin walls, no roofs. And if there's any companies who are involved in those larger.
It's relatively early days for that. It's quite early days for retrofit in general, but we are starting to look at block plans. So I recently did a few sample surveys and plans for a SPAN estate in South East London, SPAN architects. It was sort of 1950s, 1960s, sort of cross-wall construction. There's an estate that's listed. So we're restricted, they are restricted in what they can do. They want to get some ideas of how they would upgrade the whole estate, so they asked us to look at 3 sample flats representative of the whole estate in terms of position, so kind of 2 to 3 story development spread over a park in a sort of park estate. So we looked at one sort of terrace top floor flat, middle floor flat, and ground floor flat. And that covered all the sort of situations that arise in any of the flats in the development. And wrote reports, so samples, and then we're sort of looking at working with the freehold committee, and there's another company involved for sort of looking at how we would tackle the whole estate in one go. It's challenging, but certain easy things you can do, or difficult ones. So the walls are a problem, windows, this building's the windows issue.
Any other questions from the floor?
Oh, sorry, just one.
Gentleman there, and then we'll come to you, Robert.
Thank you. I'm just interested in why you bother doing an EPC assessment at the beginning, why you don't target an actual operational performance of the building.
Well, it's not a lodged EPC. It's just we're using the same software that's used for an EPC, and that's a practical consideration. It's about the skills needed to roll out retrofit across the country. We know there are a large number of domestic energy assessors. Many of those have upgraded to retrofit assessor. So there's a kind of standard there. You could, if you wanted, so you can also use full SAP or asset house planning package to model and plan a retrofit. Arguably better tool for typically planning house asset house planning package. But if you did that, that would mean you would be struggling to find people to do the assessment and modelling, and it would massively increase the cost. So using RDSAP, which is the methodology underlying EPCs, is a practical way of making sure you have the people you need to do the work and it can be delivered at an affordable.
And I think there's some grants that stipulate you have to have EPC down the rubbish head in order to qualify. One of the ones that we had last week, we mentioned that.
And sometimes some of the grants actually require a better EPC. So I think for the boiler upgrade scheme,
Insulation, I think there's one to target.
I suppose it depends on the target, the goals of the scheme. So if it's to encourage fabric first approach and subsidise homes with a poor EPC.
Okay. For last question, very quickly, Lola. It's got to be quick. Microphone for this one.
Thanks for that. On the Country Farm television programme yesterday afternoon, there was a company marketing cushions that you use to knock out chimneys. I've got 7 chimneys in my house, and it never occurs to me to be a good idea to stop heat loss to block up chimneys. Do you advocate blocking up chimneys?
I do advocate blocking them, but I just would recommend being a bit cautious about how you block them. So you don't want to block them completely. You want to avoid howling gale blowing down a disused chimney flue, but you also need to ensure continued ventilation of the chimney breast. So what I usually, are you talking about the balloons? Is it sort of like a foil balloon that you inflate up the chimney?
I couldn't actually see how it worked. Was there wool?
Okay.
Made of wool.
A sheet.
Like a cushion. You put the
Sheep
sheet
up.
The chimney sheet is one of the.
That's it.
Yes.
That's what I'm body.
Yeah, so it's basically just a square or round block of felt
To fit.
a tight fit in the chimney.
I think we can leave it.
Okay. All of it, you just need to downsize from your castle, Richard. Okay, I'm going to wrap up that half of the evening, if that's okay. We're going to have a 5-minute break, go to the loo, check football scores, whatever you need to do, and we'll start again in a few minutes. But thank you to Ian for a wonderful presentation.